Have you ever imagined what you would do if, in the middle of a deadly blizzard, a bear cub appeared at your door, trembling, fragile, with almost no strength to stand? Amidst the piercing silence of the icy forest, the wind howled as if carrying a grim warning. The accumulated snow covered everything around, transforming the landscape into a white, cold, and unforgiving desert. And then, tock, tock, tock. In the absolute isolation of a forgotten Alaskan cabin, a lone man hears an unlikely sound. Soft, desperate beats. He hesitates. What could be out there asking for help in the middle of nowhere? The ice crunched beneath his feet as he approached the door. His breathing became heavier, forming small clouds in the freezing air. With a mixture of fear and curiosity, he turns the knob. And there, huddled in the snow, is a bear cub. Small, weak, his eyes pleading for something he can't say in words. The shock takes over. Instinct screams to close the door. After all, where there is a cub, there is a mother. And a mother bear can be deadly. But there's something in that look, a silent plea, a last ray of hope. He can't just ignore it. What happened to this little bear? Where is your family? How did he get there, alone in a cold that freezes the soul? The man's mind races. He remembers the stories of the region, of cubs separated from their mothers by storms, of orphaned bears who don't survive the freezing nights. He feels the weight of the decision on his shoulders. Helping a bear could mean signing your own sentence, but ignoring him means condemning him to death. As he stares at that vulnerable little creature, a question arises. What would you do in this situation? And now, faced with this heartbreaking scene, I ask you, what would you do? Would you risk opening the door and helping this helpless puppy, knowing that its mother could be nearby? Or would you turn your back, ignoring the silent cry for help, letting nature take its course? That's a decision no one would want to make. But it happened that freezing night, and I want to know your opinion. Comment below what you would do in this extreme situation. Your comment not only helps engage this community passionate about heartwarming animal rescue stories, but it also helps more people learn about this unbelievable story. And if you like stories like this, full of emotion, tension, and twists, leave a like so that YouTube understands that this content is worth sharing. This really helps the channel to grow and continue bringing breathtaking stories. And of course, if you haven't registered yet, take advantage now and join us. Activate the bell so you don't miss the next videos, because what happens next in this story will surprise you. The storm raged outside as if it wanted to tear every piece of that frozen forest from the ground. The sharp wind made the dry branches creak like the laments of invisible creatures. The snow piled up in treacherous drifts, burying any trace of life that had dared to defy the cold. Alaska was unforgiving, and that night, it was even more cruel. Inside the small wooden cabin, Mike adjusted the flame in the fireplace, watching the embers dance as the heat tried to drive away the ice that insisted on seeping through the cracks in the windows. His body was warm, but his soul, empty. He had become accustomed to solitude. I had chosen that voluntary exile, far from the chaos of civilization, exchanging noise and artificial lights for the brutal silence of nature. But no matter how much he told himself he didn't need anyone, there were moments, like this one, when an emptiness struck him like the winter wind itself. Mike was a man of history. A former adventurer, he had already traveled through dense forests, climbed treacherous mountains, explored regions where few dared to tread. But little by little, the adrenaline gave way to exhaustion. He exchanged expeditions for isolation, seeking peace, finding only the weight of time. The storm outside was unforgiving, and it was in the midst of this chaos that he heard the knocks, weak, soft, almost imperceptible amid the roar of the wind. His heart sped up. There, in the middle of nowhere, no one knocked on his door. The cold mercilessly punished any living being that dared to be exposed for too long. A human being would not survive in that snow without protection. A wild animal would hardly approach a hut. So, what could it be? Mike stood up slowly, each step echoing on the wooden floor. The sound repeated. Tock, tock, tock. Something, or someone, was on the other side. He grabbed the handle, hesitated. His survival instinct screamed that he shouldn't open it. In Alaska, nature follows its own rules, but curiosity, or perhaps something stronger, made him turn the knob. The door opened, and the sight before him made his heart sink. There he was, small, curled up, a completely exhausted bear cub. His fur, covered in snow, trembled with every gust of wind. His eyes, large and dark, carried a silent plea. Fear, hunger, cold. Mike froze. His instinct told him to close the door immediately. Where there is a cub, there is a mother. And an unexpected encounter with a bear could be a one-way ticket to the next world. But something in that little being prevented him from acting rationally. The cub tried to get up, but its paws failed. He fell into the snow, letting out a weak groan. His body was exhausted. No strength. If he stayed out there any longer, he would die. The dilemma settled in his mind. Helping him could be dangerous. But to ignore him was to sign his death warrant. And that's when I ask you, if you were in Mike's shoes, what would you do? Would you risk your safety to save this little life, or follow the cold rules of survival? I want to know your opinion in the comments, right here below, because this story deserves to be discussed. What happened that night was simply unbelievable, and I want you to be part of that conversation. And if you're as involved in this story as I am, take the opportunity to leave a like. This really helps this video reach more people who love exciting animal rescue stories. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, now is the perfect time to do so. Activate the bell so you don't miss what comes next, because this story is far from over. And what happens next will surprise you. The wind roared, howling like a wounded animal, scattering snowflakes that danced through the air before smashing against the weathered wood of the cabin. The storm seemed to give no respite, punishing everything around it, as if it was determined to bury the night under layers and layers of relentless ice. From inside, the only light came from the flames in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The heat inside contrasted brutally with the biting cold outside. Mike could feel the difference. He could hear the icy breeze whistling through every crack in the cabin. But as accustomed as he was to the loneliness and dangers of Alaska, nothing prepared him for what he found when he opened that door. The bear cub was there, small, fragile, a dark shadow against the white expanse of snow. His fur was wet and caked with ice, and each breath felt like a Herculean effort, forming little clouds in the freezing air. He was shaking uncontrollably, his paws sunk into the soft snow, as if the last of his strength was draining away there, in front of Mike. But it was his eyes that made the man's heart falter. They were big, dark, pleading. There was no threat there. There was no predatory instinct, just a silent request that crossed any barrier between man and animal. For a moment, Mike didn't know how to react. His instinct screamed to close the door. He knew what that meant. Where there is a cub, there is a mother. Bears are fiercely protective of their cubs, and an encounter with one would not end well for him. But something was wrong. If the mother had been around, this little one wouldn't be there, alone, exposed, knocking on a human's door. Mike pursed his lips, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the snow, searching for any sign, any movement. Nothing. Just the white blanket of the snow-covered forest, just the sound of the wind cutting through the silence of the night. Still, he hesitated. Housing a bear cub could be a fatal mistake, but it could also be that little one's only chance to survive. The cub tried to take a step, but its legs gave out. He fell sideways into the snow, panting, breathing heavily. It was at that moment that something inside Mike broke. He couldn't ignore that. He couldn't just close the door and pretend he didn't see it. Slowly, crouching down, he reached out his hand. The cub flinched slightly as if expecting something bad, but didn't back away. Her fragile little body was giving in to the cold. With every second that passed, the chance of survival decreased. Damn, Mike muttered, feeling the weight of that decision. He pulled up the blanket that was hanging on the chair next to the door and, with one careful movement, wrapped the puppy around it. The small body was stiff with cold, as if the snow itself had sunk into its bones. Lifting him was easier than I expected. He offered no resistance, just accepted the help, too weak to do anything else. Mike walked in quickly. kicking the door shut with a thud. Now inside the cabin, with the cub protected from the merciless wind, he could see him better. The little one was thin. His fur was disheveled and wet. His eyes were half closed with exhaustion. He looked too young to be alone. The question was ringing in Mike's head. Where was his mother? Placing the puppy next to the fireplace, Mike walked away a little, without taking his eyes off him. I didn't know what to expect. Bears aren't exactly known for snuggling with humans, but this little one didn't show fear or aggression, just tiredness. Little by little, the heat from the fire began to take effect. The cub stirred, tremors still racking his body, but his breaths became slower, deeper. He didn't sleep, not yet, but his eyes began to blink slowly, almost as if he were fighting sleep. Mike scratched the back of his head, taking a deep breath. What was he doing? Bringing a bear cub into the house? This was crazy. If his mother showed up there, she would definitely break down the door to get him back. But what if she wasn't around anymore? The silence inside the cabin was heavy. Only the crackle of wood burning in the fireplace filled the space. Mike watched the puppy, who was now curling up on himself, trying to find a comfortable position. Something about that scene struck him strangely, like a knot squeezing his chest. The last time he saw a look like that was many years ago. He closed his eyes for a moment, pushing away old memories. This was no time to think about the past. He had a very present problem to deal with. He looked back at the small being before him. If that creature knocked on her door, it was because instinct told her that she could find help there. And now, what to do? If he stayed there all night, would he be safe? What if the puppy didn't resist? What could he give to feed him? And the mother? If it had been nearby, it would certainly have appeared by now. But what if she was injured, or worse, dead? Alaska does not forgive the weak. And in that storm, a cub alone wouldn't stand a chance. Mike let out a long sigh, resting his arms on his knees. He never considered himself a soft-hearted man, but there in front of that little life, something inside him said that he had already made his choice. And now I want to hear from you. If you were in Mike's shoes, what would you do? Would you help the cub at the risk of attracting its mother and suffering the consequences? Or would you ignore it, letting nature take its course? Write in the comments, I would help, or I would let nature do its thing. I want to see who would have the courage to make this decision. And if you're involved in this story like me, don't forget to leave a like. This helps this video reach more people who love real and heartwarming animal rescue stories. If you're not already part of this community, take the opportunity now to sign up and activate the bell, because what happens after that night is something no one expected. The silence inside the cabin was interrupted only by the crackling of wood in the fireplace and the sound of the puppy's heavy breathing. The little one was still shivering, even under the heat of the flame, as if his body was struggling to understand that he was finally out of the cruel cold. Mike watched his every move, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and uncertainty. He knew he was taking a huge risk. Wild bears are not domestic animals. They are not puppies that can be taken in without consequences. Why did he come here? Where was the mother? The forest was covered in fresh snow. The wind was roaring outside like a hungry beast, and any footprints that might have been left were already quickly disappearing beneath the white blanket. Mike looked at his own snowy boots melting on the ground and knew that if he wanted to understand the situation better, he would have to go out and look for signs before it was too late. But what about the puppy? Leaving him alone didn't seem like an option. If he was too weak to react, he might simply not hold out until Mike returned. Taking a deep breath, he made a decision. He took an extra blanket, wrapped the little one more tightly, and placed one of his leather jackets next to him so that it could absorb the heat from the fireplace. At least this way, the puppy would have some chance of staying warm. Mike grabbed his flashlight, his rifle, not because he wanted to use it, but because he knew the forest was no place to go unarmed, and pushed the door hard against the wind. The freezing wind hit him in the face like blades of ice, forcing him to close his eyes for a moment before moving forward. Every step in the snow was heavy, sinking inches with each movement, and the relentless cold burned his lungs as he breathed in. The first few minutes were fruitless, just snow, wind, and the darkness of the forest. But then, he saw it. Footprints. They were larger than the cubs, spaced far enough apart to indicate they belonged to an adult bear. But something was wrong. Mike crouched down, pointing the flashlight closer. The markings were disorganized, as if the bear had walked in circles, hesitated. Some areas appeared dragged, as if the animal was weak or injured. The trail continued for a few meters until it completely disappeared where the snow had accumulated. That explained everything. Mom was here. Or at least it was. But now, where was she? Mike felt a weight in his chest. He had seen this before. Bears that strayed too far from their cubs were often injured, sick, or dead. If that were the case, the little bear that was now resting in his cabin was completely alone in the world. He had no one to protect him, no one to teach him how to survive the merciless Alaskan winter. An orphaned bear doesn't stand much of a chance, and Mike knew that better than anyone. His gaze returned to the dark forest. The storm was only getting worse, and there were no signs of the bear nearby. He could look further, but he knew that if she hadn't come back by now, she probably never would. Pursing his lips, he made his decision. Returning to the cabin with quick, determined steps, Mike closed the door behind him and shook the snow off his coat. The cabin felt like a world apart compared to the cold and darkness outside. The cub was still there, curled up, eyes blinking slowly, too exhausted to react to his arrival. Mike knew that if he left him there to follow his instinct and return to the forest, he wouldn't last long. Temperatures would plummet even further, and the little one would not have the strength to hunt or protect himself. He could try to release him in the morning, give him a chance, but that would only delay the inevitable. Crouching down next to the puppy, he ran his hand over the blanket, feeling the little one's warm breath under the fabric. Something inside him tightened. He never wanted to be responsible for anything other than himself, but now there was a living being there who, in some way, trusted him. That somehow, he had chosen his cabin as his last refuge. "Okay, big guy," Mike murmured, barely realizing he was speaking out loud. "Let's see what we can do for you." He got up and went to the cabin's small kitchen. Rummaging through the cupboards, he found a few things that could help. Dried fish, some smoked meat, even a jar of honey that he kept for the rare moments when he wanted to sweeten his coffee. With a piece of fish in his hand, he slowly approached the cub. The little one opened his eyes when he smelled the smell, but didn't make any sudden movements. He was hungry, that much was clear. Mike placed the fish on the ground, very close to the cub's nose, and moved away a little. The little one hesitated for a moment, but then slowly moved, dragging himself a few centimeters to get the food. With difficulty, he took the piece and chewed slowly. Mike watched everything in silence. That simple gesture meant a lot. It meant the baby still had the strength to eat, who still wanted to fight. What would come next, he didn't know. But at that moment, he knew he couldn't turn his back. Now I ask you, what do you think Mike should do? Should he try to take the cub back to the forest and let it go on its way? Or should I keep him around until he was strong enough to survive? Write in the comments, let him go, if you think he should let you go, or take care of him, if he believes Mike needs to help him longer. Your opinion is important, and I want to know what you would do in this situation. And if this story is catching you as much as it does me, leave a like. This really helps this video reach more people who are moved by real stories of animal rescues and extreme survival. If you are not yet registered, take advantage now and join this community. Activate the bell because the most intense part of this story is yet to come, and you won't want to miss it. The silence in the cabin felt heavier than ever. Mike felt the heat of the fireplace touching his skin, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. He looked at the little being curled up near the fire, still shaking, still fragile, but with his eyes a little more alive after eating. The bear cub wasn't just any wild animal. He was a survivor, a piece of nature that, against all odds, had found refuge on a human's doorstep. But Mike couldn't get one question out of his head. What if his mother is around? The thought made his stomach turn. He knew stories, and there were many. Bears that tore apart hunters who got too close, that took on wolves, even male bears to protect their cubs. He had already seen what a desperate mother could do. If she were alive and looking for him, the cabin might just be an obstacle in the path of a beast that wouldn't take no for an answer. The cub moved slightly, making a faint sound. Mike narrowed his eyes. That sounded like crying. He swallowed hard. I had never heard a bear make a sound so fragile, so human. It felt like a mix of regret and exhaustion, like he finally felt safe enough to break down. Something inside Mike tightened. That sound stirred something deep inside him, something he couldn't name. Kneeling down next to the cub, he took a closer look at its condition. There was still hardened snow stuck to his fur, ice between his little toes. He needed to dry him completely, or the cold that had already infiltrated his body could be fatal. Taking a dry cloth, he began to clean it carefully, feeling the rough fur under his hands. The cub trembled but did not resist. Just let him continue. With each touch, with each light friction to remove the moisture, Mike felt how vulnerable that little being was. Nature was brutal. He knew this better than anyone. And there, in front of him, was living proof that sometimes she just couldn't forgive. As time passed, the puppy began to snuggle into the blanket. Its small claws tugged at the fabric instinctively, as if searching for something familiar to hold on to. Mike noticed that and took a deep breath. He shouldn't get attached. This was a mistake, but it was already too late. He stood up, running a hand over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. I needed to decide what to do. I couldn't just stand there. The cub couldn't stay there forever, but taking him back to the forest now? No, he wouldn't survive. It was then that a sound outside froze his blood. A snap. Someone, or something was out there. Mike stood still, his ears open. The wind was still strong, but he was sure he hadn't imagined it. He grabbed his rifle instinctively, going to the window. The darkness of the storm made it impossible to see anything beyond the range of the dim light of the flashlight outside the cabin. But he knew he wasn't alone. The heart was beating hard. What if it was the baby's mother? If she was there, wandering through the forest, looking for the little one? What if she had smelled him and was ready to attack? Mike held his breath. I knew I needed to act carefully. Opening the door at that moment was a risk, but ignoring it could be an even bigger mistake. Holding tight to the gun, he slowly unlocked the door and opened it just enough to peer outside. The cold wind hit his face, but he ignored the discomfort. He looked around, straining his eyes against the darkness. Nothing. But then another snap. This time closer. Mike felt a shiver go up his spine. Something was there. He could feel it. But where? He stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The cold seemed to seep straight into his bones, but he didn't care. I needed to know what was hanging around the cabin. I needed to understand if I was in danger. And then he saw it. About 20 meters away, something moved between the trees. It wasn't big enough to be an adult bear, but it wasn't small enough to be a harmless animal either. Mike swallowed. Lobos. Two pairs of bright eyes reflected the lantern light, slowly moving around the clearing. He clenched his jaw. This was not good. Wolves normally avoided humans, but a vulnerable bear cub? This was an opportunity they would not ignore. Mike backed slowly into the cabin, closing the door behind him and locking it immediately. His heart hammered against his chest. The cub, still curled up in the blanket, didn't seem to realize the danger that was lurking. Mike closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He couldn't leave the little one out there now, not with predators so close. Running a hand through his hair, he tried to organize his thoughts. His entire life had been guided by simple rules of survival. Never intervene too much. Never put yourself in danger for something you couldn't control. But he had already broken all those rules that night. The cub made that faint sound again, an almost pleading sound, as if he somehow felt there was still danger out there. Mike balled his hands into fists. He never wanted to be a hero, But looking at that little being that nature seemed to have condemned, he knew he couldn't just ignore it. Now I ask you, what should Mike do? Keeping the cub in the cabin until the storm passed, even though he knew wolves were nearby? Or release him in the morning, hoping he would find a way to survive on his own? Comment here. Protect the cub if you think Mike should take care of him longer, or let nature act if you believe he should release you. And if you're feeling this tension with me, take the opportunity to leave a like. This really helps spread this story to more people who love exciting animal rescues. If you are not yet part of our community, sign up now and activate the bell, because what happens after that, no one could have imagined. The heat from the fireplace spread throughout the small space of the cabin, enveloping everything in a soft amber glow. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows that danced across the wooden walls, creating an almost ironic contrast with the raging storm outside. The wind was still howling, but inside, between those sturdy walls, a temporary peace reigned. The bear cub, now wrapped in the blanket, was no longer shaking as violently. His eyes were half closed, his movements were slower, but his exhaustion was still evident. Mike observed every detail, trying to understand how a being so small, so fragile, had survived long enough to reach his door. There was something almost miraculous about it. He knelt down next to the little one, studying his appearance better. Now, with the warm light illuminating its fur, it was possible to see markings that had previously been hidden beneath the hardened snow. Small cuts along the legs, likely caused by sharp ice or twisted branches. Scratches spread across his body, some deeper than others, as if he had tried to protect himself from something or someone. The hair was missing in some parts, perhaps due to malnutrition, perhaps due to a desperate escape. The sight made a lump form in Mike's throat. The little one had been suffering for much longer than he imagined. It wasn't just a puppy that got lost in the storm. He bore scars of struggle, of abandonment, of a despair that no animal should know at such a young age. The cub opened his eyes slowly, staring at Mike with an expression that made something inside him clench. It was a different look, not out of fear, not alert, but something close to confidence. Mike frowned. I had never seen this before. Bears, even cubs, were instinctively suspicious. But that little one looked at him as if he knew he was safe there, as if somehow she understood that this man was her only chance. He let out a long sigh and ran a hand over his face. That wasn't in the plans. None of this was in the plans. Mike had isolated himself to escape the complications of life, to avoid connecting, to not have to worry about anything but himself. But now there was a bear cub that depended on him. He stood up slowly, his knees slightly protesting the movement. He walked to the small makeshift kitchen in the corner of the cabin and grabbed a clean cloth and a bottle of warm water. Returning to the cub, he knelt beside him again and with careful movements began to clean the wounds. The little one flinched at first, reacting to the unexpected touch, but he didn't resist. He just watched Mike with those deep, dark eyes, as if trying to understand what he was doing. "Calm down, kid," Mike muttered, not realizing he was speaking out loud. "This will help." The marks didn't look recent. Some were healing, others were still open, but none seemed infected. This meant he had been wandering alone for days, maybe weeks. How had he managed to survive so long? How did such a small cub face the cold, hunger, and predators with no one to protect him? Mike swallowed. He knew the answer. He survived because he wanted to live. That little one's survival strength was impressive. Many animals did not last a single day without their mothers. But he had fought. He had faced whatever the world had thrown at him, and somehow he had made it to that door. Mike took another dry cloth and pressed it lightly against the puppy's fur, absorbing the remaining moisture. The little one let out a low sigh, his eyes blinking slowly. For the first time in who knows how long, he was warm. It was safe. The storm raged outside once again, as if nature itself was testing the limits of everything around it. But inside that cabin, for the first time since it all began, the puppy relaxed. He curled up in the blanket, taking a deep breath and let out a low sound, almost a purr. almost a murmur of relief. Mike stood still. He had never heard anything like this before. The truth hit him like a punch. This cub didn't just want to survive. He wanted to be saved. Mike felt the weight of that thought fall onto his shoulders. He spent so much time trying to convince himself that he was a man alone in the world, that he didn't need anyone, that he could just move forward without being attached to anything. But now there was a little being there, trusting him, depending on him. And the hardest part, he knew that deep down he was already attached. Mike stayed there, sitting on the floor, watching the little one sleep. The puppy's breathing was now slow, calm. His chest rose and fell rhythmically. Muscles that were once tense now relaxed. For the first time, he actually seemed to be resting. Mike looked away at the fireplace, lost in thought. He knew that this moment of peace would not last forever. He knew he would have to make a decision soon. The cub could stay there for another night. But what then? What if his mother was nearby, still looking for him? What if he was already marked for a destiny that Mike couldn't change? Or worse? What if he released him back into the forest and the little one simply no longer had the strength to continue on his own? The question was heavy. The silence of the cabin seemed to amplify every thought, every doubt. Mike ran a hand through his hair, letting out a long sigh. He never wanted to be responsible for anyone. But now, looking at that little being, something inside him said that maybe he already was. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Mike should accept the fact that this puppy is part of his life now? Or should he prepare to release him as soon as possible? Right here in the comments, stay with him if you think Mike should take care of the puppy, or let him go if he believes he should return it to nature. And if this story touched you in some way, if you felt this connection as much as I did, leave a like right now. This helps a lot, so that this video reaches more people who love exciting animal rescue stories. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take advantage of this moment. Activate the bell, because what happens after that night, no one could predict. The sun had not yet fully risen above the horizon when Mike woke up, feeling the morning chill seep through the small cracks in the cabin. The fire in the fireplace was still burning, but weaker, spreading only a gentle heat throughout the room. He blinked a few times, trying to shake off the drowsiness, and for a moment he almost forgot what had happened the night before. But then, his eyes fell on the little being curled up next to the fireplace. The bear cub was still there. His breathing was slow and deep, and his body, now dry and warm, no longer trembled as before. He slept in a way that only those who have experienced moments of pure despair can sleep, exhausted, surrendered, as if he were finally safe. Mike watched the puppy for a few moments. The little one moved slightly, letting out a faint murmur, and then he shrunk back into the blanket even more. The scene made something tighten inside Mike. As much as he tried to convince himself that this was temporary, that bear wasn't his problem, he knew that somehow the bond was already formed. But something still bothered him. What if his mother was around? He needed to find out. Carefully he got up, picked up his thick coat and put on his boots. Before leaving, he took one last look at the cub. He didn't even move. He slept soundly, so different from the trembling, frightened creature that had knocked on his door the night before. As Mike opened the door to the cabin, he felt the impact of the morning cold. The wind was still biting, but the storm had passed. The sky was clear, tinged with bluish and golden tones by the sun that was beginning to appear on the horizon. Fresh snow covered everything in a soft, untouched layer, except for one detail. Footprints, big, heavy. Mike froze. His heart sped up. They were there, just a few meters from the cabin, forming an irregular trail that snaked through the snow before disappearing between the trees. They weren't from a wolf. They weren't from any small animal. He knew those footprints. An adult bear was there. His gaze swept the surrounding forest, tension pulsing through his veins. He couldn't see her, but he knew she had been close. What did this mean? Did she smell the puppy? Could it be that you were trying to find him? Mike followed the footprints with his eyes, trying to understand their pattern. They seemed hesitant, as if the bear had been prowling the area but not getting too close to the cabin. What stopped her? The smell of human? The fire in the fireplace? He knew he needed to act. If the cub's mother was around, he needed to give her a chance to reunite with the little one. Turning quickly, he went back inside the cabin. The puppy was still sleeping, breathing peacefully. Mike hesitated for a moment, then walked over to him and knelt down beside him. "Kid, I think your mom came looking for you." The little bear stirred slightly at the sound of Mike's voice, his eyes slowly opening. He blinked a few times drowsily and lifted his head a little. Mike felt a tightness in his chest. He wanted to believe that the right thing to do was to keep the little one safe, to continue taking care of him. But he knew the truth. This cub belonged to the forest. Mike took a deep breath and, with all the care in the world, took the blanket and wrapped it around the puppy, lifting him firmly. The little one instinctively snuggled against his chest, warm and relaxed. He didn't resist. As Mike left the cabin, he felt the morning chill enveloping them both. The sun was now slowly rising into the sky, illuminating the forest with a cold, golden light. He walked slowly, following the footprints in the snow, heading in the direction the bear seemed to have come from. With each step, I felt the weight of that decision. He didn't know if she was still there. I didn't know if the puppy would be safe. But he knew that if there was any chance of him meeting his mother again, it was now. Upon reaching an open clearing, Mike stopped. There, surrounded by the white expanse of the forest, he bent down and released the little bear onto the ground covered in soft snow. The cub hesitated, looking at him, as if waiting for some instruction. "Come on, kid," Mike said softly. The cub blinked. His body was stronger now, his movements less shaky. He stayed there for a few seconds, as if he was processing the situation. And then, something happened. A sound came from the forest. A grunt. Low. Deep. Mike felt a shiver go up his spine. The cub turned its head immediately. Its ears perked up. Its entire body became alert. He knew that sound. Another grunt. This time, closer. And then, there, in the shadows of the trees, Mike saw it. A huge figure moved slowly among the snow-covered trunks. Mike's heart hammered in his chest. He held his breath, feeling his body stiffen. The mother. She was there. The bear stopped a few feet away, her black eyes fixed on the scene before her. His body was large, robust, an absolute contrast to the small being huddled in the snow. Mike didn't move. He knew that any sudden movement could be interpreted as a threat. The cub remained motionless for a moment. Then, as if something finally made sense in his mind, he began to walk. Small steps at first, hesitant, then faster, and then he ran. Mike watched, his chest tight, as the little one disappeared towards his mother. The bear lowered her head and sniffed him as soon as he got close. There was a moment's pause, and then she accepted it. The cub snuggled against its mother's leg as if it had finally found what it was looking for. Mike let out a long sigh, feeling the weight of that entire night finally lift. He took a step back, and then something unexpected happened. The cub looked at him. Just for a moment. But that look said it all. There was no fear. There was no despair. Just a silent recognition. As if somehow he understood what that human had done for him. And then, together with his mother, he disappeared into the forest. Mike stood there for a while, looking at the empty space where the two of them used to be. The wind blew gently, bringing an almost comforting silence. And at that moment, he realized something. No matter how harsh nature was, no matter how cruel and savage the world might seem, there was still room for compassion. Now tell me, if you were in Mike's place, would you have the courage to release the puppy? Comment here, try whether you believe he made the right decision or no. If you think you should have taken care of the little one for longer. And if this story touched you, leave a like. This really helps spread this video to more people who love heartwarming animal rescue stories. And if you haven't registered yet, sign up now and activate the bell, because this was just the beginning. And there are many more incredible stories to come. This little bear's story wasn't just about survival. It was about instinct, about destiny, about the unlikely bond that can emerge between a man and a wild animal in the midst of unforgiving nature. Mike had no idea that, on that freezing night, when he heard those faint knocks on the door, his life would change in such a profound way. He didn't plan on being a hero, nor did he want to carry the weight of such a difficult choice. But the moment he looked into that helpless puppy's eyes, something inside him spoke louder. And now, after everything, after the storm, the fear, the doubt, after the decision to release the little one into the forest and see him reunited with his mother, there was only a dense silence in the clearing where he was. The wind blew lightly, lifting snowflakes from the ground, as if nature itself was ending that story. Mike was still staring at the empty space where, seconds before, the cub and its mother had been. The look on that little being's face before he left was still etched in his mind. A look of recognition. A look of something that could be interpreted as gratitude. He didn't know if he would ever see that bear again. The forest is vast, the paths cross and are lost in time. But somehow, Mike felt that this meeting had not been by chance. What brought the cub to him that night? Why, among so many places in the vastness of the forest, did he choose that cabin? He would never have those answers. But something inside him said he didn't need to have them. And now I ask you, did this story touch you in any way? If so, share it with someone who loves animals. Together we can spread stories like this that show the more human side of wildlife, that remind us that even in the harshest of conditions, compassion always finds a way to shine. And more than that, I want to know your opinion. What if it were you? If a bear cub showed up at your door one freezing night, what would you do? Would you have the courage to open it? Would you take care of him? Would you release him into the forest immediately? Tell me here in the comments, because this is a difficult decision, and I want to know what you would do in this situation. Right here, I would help if you believe it would be right to welcome him, or I would let nature act if you think he should face the world alone. And if you like real and exciting stories like this, subscribe to the channel right now. Here, each video brings a new journey, a new moment of tension, overcoming, and emotion. Activate the bell so you don't miss anything, because I promise this was just one of many incredible stories to come.